Firsov tried to organize a proletarian university in Moscow, but they failed. Bogdanov then succeeded in establishing the Communist Academy and became a member of its board. Secondly, the second task, the proletariat must create a general science to investigate both natural and social laws and work out a universal methodology that would allow to regulate nature and to carry out social transformations. The supreme goal of the proletarian scientific the supreme goal of proletarian scientific knowledge from the social perspective is the establishment of a technologically and culturally highly developed and ideologically homogeneous society. That means actually establishing socialism. In the article, the next step or the next aspect of the program of proletarian culture, in the article Proletarian Culture International Language, Bogdanov claims that since the proletariat's final purpose is establishing socialism in the world, international dialogue and international communication are a necessary part of its activity. Therefore, learning foreign languages and the invasion of a universal language appears to be significant points of the political agenda. Bogdanov argues that English, it's amazing, can function as an international language for the transitional period of toward socialism. In general, Bogdanov characterizes proletarian culture as a socialist revolution in the working class. Revising the history of the October Revolution 1921, he claims that this transformation proceeds in two steps. Quote, it begins with the forming a militant consciousness of the working class. The proletariat manifests its will to overthrow the general social system, trying to seize power. And the final step is not negative but positive. It's the building a developed, creative, practically organizational consciousness. Bogdanov acknowledges that so far only its foundations have been laid by the organizational experience of the workers' movement, by Marxist theory, and by the embryos of proletarian art. Even consider Bogdanov, even among the advanced groups of the working class in the West, it's the revolutionary, a creative meaning of the proletarian consciousness is not realized yet. In his view, for example, the collapse of the Second International was in the first line an expression of the cultural dependence of the proletariat. Yeah, so much. How many time do I have? How much time do I have?
You need to be drawing it to a close now, Maja.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose I don't have time to tell about proletarian art, but my last word. But from what I have already said, it's clear what we can expect, regarding to proletarian art. It's the same logic. In all these papers, Bogdanov develops an organizational point of view on art. Art is an ideology of the proletariat. Ideology is meant not in political sense, but in the original sense of this word by Dessous de Tracy. Ideology is a sum of ideas. In Bogdanov's theory, art is a subsystem of culture. While the role of culture is the organization of the working class in the building a collective subject of historical transformation of society, the role of art consists of the forming a proletarian personality. Thus, we see that Bogdanov consistently applies the principle of his the general organizational science in all areas and all levels of social life, including culture and art. And it's amazing that even his feelings, Bogdanov's feelings, were technologically organized. His favorite artist was Constantin Meunier, the glorifier of the working class. Thank you for your attention. I'm so sorry that I couldn't don't have time to for the whole presentation. So
that was an excellent presentation there. Thank you so much for making such a clear distinction and fascinating distinction about the working class and the development of the proletariat. So thank you very much for that. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But now we move on to our second presentation by Noemi Ghetti, who is going to talk about Between Russia and Italy, from Bogdanov to Gramsci, the cultural pathway towards revolution. Noemi?
Hello? Hello, here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Do you have a presentation to load?
Yeah, I have no presentation.
Okay, all right then. I'll hand over to you and you have 20 minutes for your presentation, your talk.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my English, and I'm sorry for not showing any PowerPoint presentation. Many thanks to the organizing committee, and especially to Orson Senalp and to Andrea Siacarella, research mates in these years. A few years ago, the study of a singular document, a double card written by Antonio Gramsci and a young woman he had only recently met, Julia Schucht, would be his future wife, first introduced me to Alexander Bogdanov, who was almost unknown in Italy. The postcard, which was written in Ivanovo-Voznosensk on October 16, 1922, contained a compromising message, drawings, and humorous quips, and was addressed to Julia's sister Evgenia, who was Nazeda Krupskaya's secretary. It was on that occasion that I discovered Bogdanov's relationship with Gramsci, whose theoretical legacy has been censored for numerous years. From two drafts of a letter written by Julia some days before, October 11, 1922, I learned the existence of a translation project. Gramsci had asked Julia to work with him with the translation of Bogdanov's bestseller, Red Star, to be published by both of them in Italy. Quote, I've started translating Bogdanov's novel. I'm writing without rereading, which is a torture. Organizing my words will make you so angry, but that is what professors are for. And I, before seeing your signature on the translation, will have to resign myself to having my hair turn out, unquote. The first bibliography of Bogdanov and Gramsci I found then was scant but significant. In 1981, the Novia Socor's title, Was Bogdanov Russia's Answer to Gramsci, proposes not an improbable chronological precedence. Gramsci was, in fact, 18 years younger, but a parallelism between their studies on the question of proletarian culture, outlining each intellectual's position on Lenin's political ideas, with the intention of showing the nearness of Bolshevism and European Marxism. The extensive study, to this day almost unknown in Italy, is still valid for the richness of the argumentations and the perspectives opened. In that same year, 1981, the journal Primo Maggio published the paper Breve storia del prolet cult italiano, Brief History of Italian Prolet Cult by Cesare Bermani, a work which the author would publish again in 2007, together with other important contributes. The paper traces how, in the summer of 1920, during the Second Comintern Congress, with the support of Lunacharsky and the approval of every European country, the international prolet cult was born in Russia. A few months later, on January 21, before Congress of Manifesto of the Institute of Proletary Culture, the Turing branch of the Russian prolet cult, presented as an instrument of the program of the auto-emancipation of workers. In October of that same year, 1921, l'Ordine Nuovo published La Poesia Proletaria, Proletarian Poetry, the essay of Bogdanov, in 2 installments. It was the first Italian translation of a Bogdanov's work. The convergence between Bogdanov and Gramsci had distant roots. In 1914, while Bogdanov was abandoning politics forever to dedicate himself to culture, with initiatives like the Proletarian University and Encyclopedia, Gramsci was becoming a member of the Socialist Party, introduced to it by his friend Angelo Tasca. In 1912, Tasca had presented a radical refounding cultural project at the Socialist Youth Congress in Bologna, where the memory of recent Bogdanov's school was very much alive. For this reason, Tasca was accused of culturism by Amedeo Bordiga, the future first secretary of the Communist Party, in a bitter and drawn-out political controversy. The attention that Gramsci gave to Russian culture developed in proto-industrial Turin, where Russian exiles were quite numerous. In 1917, the year of the revolutions and of the foundation of the prolet cult, a Russian delegation spoke, acclaimed by the crowd, from the windows of the local chamber of labor. In that same year, in Turin, a Russian grammar book was published, so successful that in 1926, the publishing house Slavia was founded. We know even who was a main translator, Piero Gobetti, a fellow of Gramsci killed by fascists, later killed by fascists. Meanwhile, the understanding that languages affirmed themselves with hegemonic dynamics from the base, which Gramsci learned in his glottology course from Matteo Bartoli, had spread to the field of the culture, establishing his conviction that education had a fundamental role in substituting bourgeois domination with a new proletarian hegemony. Enriched by the socialist militancy and his strong activity as a cultural journalist for Avanti and Il Grido del Popolo, the attention to culture had led Gramsci to found, in the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, the Ordine Nuovo, on May the 1st, 1919, and to conceive consigli di fabbrica, factory councils that are the original version of Russian Soviets. This interest was later encouraged with ties with the international movement through his friend Piero Sraffa, who in 1921-22 studied at the London School of Economics and collaborated with John Maynard Keynes at Cambridge. Gramsci's activity, merely mentioned here, and his spontaneous convergence with the ideas of Bogdanov, of which Lenin was certainly informed, seemed to be so obvious that in 1981, Bermani, the historian I mentioned before, wrote that only dogmatic motives have kept us from understanding the profound and lasting influence of the prolet cult ideas on Gramsci elaboration. Clear to anyone who scrolls L'Ordine Nuovo. Gramsci's adhesion to the ideas of prolet cult, in fact, in the years 1920-22 was absolute. And it would be strange, Bermani adds, if Gramsci had not tried to understand better the ideas of prolet cult during his stay in the Soviet Union, when the debate between the supporters of prolet cult and Lenin was very heated. At the end of May 1922, just after organizing together with the prolet cult of Turin the visit of a vast delegation of workers to the International Exposition of Futurist Art, guided by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, Gramsci left for Moscow. He had been invited to the enlarged committee of the International, together with the delegation of the Communist Party, Italian Communist, led by his adversary Bordiga. Called by Lev Trotsky to give an account of the initiative, Turinese initiative, Gramsci answered with a letter, Lettera sul futurismo italiano, which was published in L'Ordine Nuovo in September and later published by Trotsky himself in Russia. The letter induced one to think that Gramsci, well known for his political and cultural activities, had been certainly invited to remain in Moscow to mediate the reunification of Italian communists and socialists, which the Central Executive of the International solicited and Bordiga hindered. But probably he had also been invited to facilitate the complete submission of the prolet cult under the Narkompros, since the prolet cult's autonomy had already been drastically limited by the Central Committee's decree sui prolet cult in December 1920. To this regard, we must add Gramsci's mentioned mission in 1922 to Ivanovo-Voznesensk, the important Russian textile district shaken by violent strikes, in whose factories 26 sections of the prolet cult could be found. Julia Schucht, who lived there with her family and taught violin in a music lyceum, had only just started working in the local branch of the party. Acting as his interpreter, she accompanied him to different factories for a few days. It is while waiting for Gramsci to arrive in Ivanovo-Voznesensk that Julia had written to him about the above-mentioned translation of Bogdanov's Red Star. The translations and the revisions were finished, as we can see in Umberto Terracini's letter of April 1924, in which he tells Gramsci that the Russian novel of which you edited the translation was on its way from Moscow. On October 25, before the Fourth Congress, Lenin, convalescing after his first stroke, wanted to receive Gramsci. On October 28, Mussolini marched into Rome. 1 year later, in November 1923, when Bogdanov was released from the prison, Gramsci was sent from Moscow to Vienna. He stayed there while waiting to enter Italy again, protected by diplomatic immunity, anguished by the long silences of Julia, who was expecting their first child. Gramsci would return to Italy in May 1924, elected deputy and nominated secretary of the Communist Party. Meanwhile, Stalin was in power in Moscow and Mussolini in Rome. Arrested after the attempt on Mussolini in 1926, he was sent in confinement in Ustic Island, where, reminiscent of Bogdanovian experience, organized a new school for confined people open to inhabitants. In conclusion, I believe that we must consider the entity and the actuality of the relations between Gramsci and Bogdanov, even recently ignored or circumscribed within a political realm. We must reconsider their theoretical convergence in the interpretation of Marx towards the philosophy of praxis, in the idea of revolution and new hegemony, and last but not the least, in the atheist concept of history and moreover of human reality, like Maja said before. I would like to underline that by pursuing with the prolet cult the autonomy of the proletarian cultural formation from the party, Bogdanov and Gramsci add a third point to the dual dialectic between politics and economy, structure and superstructure, civil society. Civil society, which Gramsci in his prison notebooks tends to consider structure, therefore, creates a triadic dialectic state, civil society, economy. The centrality of the working class in place of the intellectuals is reestablished, setting a limit to the state economy binomial of Bolshevism and of Marxism-Leninism, which is at the root of this ultra-centralism and bureaucratization of the party. For Gramsci, civil society, which together with economy constitutes the foundation of politics, is fundamental when establishing hegemony. So simultaneously, the conditions of a possible dialectic and exchanges between those who govern and those who are governed are established. Intellectuals are not a class, and every man is a philosopher, writes Gramsci. Refusing every transcendence of the superstructural plane, he criticizes the elitism and the corporatism of intellectuals and the separateness of politics. Intellectuals, he says, must be organic to the subaltern working classes. The philosophy of praxis, the peculiar Italian declination of Marxism Gramsci developed in prison notebooks, intends to restore the correct relationship between structure and superstructure, beyond the economism of the dogmatists, but also beyond the intellectualism of the idealist, even the Marxist ones. One question remains to be asked. Did Gramsci and Bogdanov get a chance to meet? We like to think they did. When we read Craig Brandist, quote, "It is possible that Gramsci actually met Bogdanov, either at a round table discussion of Soviet foreign trade, at which both Bogdanov and Gramsci spoke in June 1922, or at a meeting with the Central Committee of Prolet Cult in December 1922. But beyond this eventuality, I think that the connection between their respective theoretical and political positions here outlined is undeniable. And I don't stop hoping that the first Italian translation of Red Star by Gramsci and Julia Schucht, hidden in some drawer somewhere, may sooner or later come to light. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noemi, for an excellent insight there into the relationship between Gramsci and Bogdanov. Absolutely fascinating. And thank you also for keeping to time so well.
Thank you,
Hopefully
Amanda.
there'll be time for some questions at the end of this session. But now I'd like to hand over to Fabian, who's going to give a talk on Tektology in the digital age, from Workers Encyclopedia to Wikipedia. Fabian?
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm just looking for am I coming up on screen?
You are.
Okay. So theoretically, I should be able to share my screen, but
it is shared. We can see your screen and your camera.
Okay, in which case I should get to this. And I should be on my presentation now. Is that working?
You are, yes. We can see the yellow slides.
Okay, that's brilliant. So what I'm going to be looking at is the implementation of the Workers Encyclopedia, which was started. The first steps towards it were developed in the United Kingdom, and the people who took this on were the Plebs League, and so they were founded in 1908, so they pre-existed the Russian Revolution, and in many ways rediscovered, principally through Colin Moore, who has been working with the post-16 education and did a lot of work at the time of the centenary of the Ruskin College strike in 1909. So this was about 10 years ago. So this is again another, going back into workers' history and pulling things back into the forefront from that period.
Fabian.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but you're not on slide 1. You're not at the beginning.
I think we can only see the application. So if you have it in slideshow mode, we're not seeing slideshow mode at the moment.
Okay. Let me see if I can come out. Right. You're seeing that, are you?
Yes, with all your slides on the left-hand slide. Yeah, there we
go. Okay. Right. Okay. So I'll go back to this. So this is what was coming out of Ruskin College before the First World War, and they developed the conception of independent working class education. And one of the main influences that happened from the USA, the Anglophone USA as well, was Daniel de Leon, and the Plebs League, they took their name from his 2 pages from Roman history. And one of the points that Colin Moore makes was that actually there was quite limited access to Marxism, whatever you may choose to understand by that term, but particularly the German social democratic tradition and the kind of dominant forms which in Russia they became tied in with it, whereas here amongst the working class there was limited access. So Ruskin College had been established as an educational institution for working class people. It was based in Oxford, but it was not part of the university. And in many ways that was a deliberate challenge to the hegemony of the ruling class. But the university fought back and attempted to take control. And a lot of the students were funded by their union. So they were not there as individuals developing, some of them no doubt were, but in principle, they were not there. They were there as part of the working class struggle to learn. And so they went on strike in the way that workers tend to do from time to time. And in the end, rather than return to Ruskin College, they set up the Plebs League, and then they started to set up labour colleges, and a number of labour colleges throughout in England and in Scotland, in the Scottish Labour College as well. And the establishment of working class colleges throughout the country, owned and controlled by the workers themselves, will do more to hasten the hour of economic deliverance than anything else we know of. So, kind of jumping forward from 1909 to the post-war period, so about 10 years, and I'm just skating over the history there, we get to this book published by Cedar Need and Poole, Prolet Cult, came out in 1921, and they are involved in the tortuous process of the founding of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which had been going on in the period of 1920 to 1921. I'm not going to go into that. You'll probably be relieved to hear. They focused on how to learn the lessons of Prolet Cult and how to apply them in the United Kingdom. So Cedar Need and Poole, basically intellectuals, and they did a lot of translating work, and they understood a broad variety of languages. So in this book, they start talking about the Workers Encyclopedia, and they say in the final paragraph of Science in the Working Class, Bogdanov refers to a workers' university and says that out of the collective life of this institution, through the joint elaboration of the best teaching systems, there must arise a workers' encyclopedia. And a little bit further on, they say there can be no workers' university in pre-revolutionary Britain. The labour colleges can concern themselves only with the provision of a fighting culture. So they're looking at Britain as pre-revolutionary and Russia as post-revolutionary, and this doesn't quite fit with Bogdanov's conception, but it does fit with the viewpoint that people attracted to Bolshevism tended to have, even if they did not necessarily understand what Bolshevism necessarily consisted of at that period in time. So, nor therefore can there be a workers' encyclopedia in the comprehensive sense in which the term is employed by Bogdanov. But prolet cultural textbooks conveying the elements of a fighting culture will supply the first requisites for such a workers' encyclopedia, and these the League hopes to provide very shortly. So there were 3 textbook conferences held in 1920 through to March 1921. Now I'm just going to place this in the context of what some of the people involved with the Plebs League were doing, and in particular I'm going to bring in H.G. Wells, who published this series, fortnightly series, The Outline of History. It started in 1919, finished in 1920. It sold that now, when it says it sold 2 million copies, that is actually, it went through a number of editions into the 40s. So it didn't sell 2 million copies from the first edition. So it wasn't quite that successful, but it was successful. And J.F. Horobin, who was a Plebs League activist, he provided the illustrations for this. And H.G. Wells said that he regarded him more as a collaborator than just an illustrator. And another veteran of the Plebs League, who was also involved in the Communist Party 1920, 1921, he left before even Bolshevization came about a bit later on. He actually worked on an updating of this outline of history in the 40s after Wells had died. So there's an interest here in encyclopedism, and Wells himself went on to write The World Brain, and he was involved in a number of initiatives, like in 1937, when there was a World Conference on Documentation, where they were starting to look at using microphotography to record documents and make copies of documents which could be readily shared across the world. So in that sense, he kind of gave the keynote speech there with some broad outlines, but it was actually linked to quite practical considerations. The University of Chicago involved, which was of course allied with the Carnap and the logical positivists and the Vienna Circle, who were promoting the idea of a scientific encyclopedia, universal, bringing science together. So that's another strand which is kind of running parallel to what Bogdanov is doing. So I'm now going to go to the preface of the first book that they came out with, and I'm going to pick up on some characteristics here. No author's name appears on the title page of the outline. So it is a communal production. And they invited all who read and use this book to send to the League suggestions for the improvement of later editions. So they didn't see that they'd reached the point of, well, this is the textbook, we've done with psychology. They saw it as something that would have to be revised to become more truly representative proletarian culture than the work of any individual. So it's changing, and then so it's changing, it's not individual, and the idea is that they're laying the foundations of a future true workers' encyclopedia. Okay, that's the kind of taking us into the why I'm saying that the Workers' Encyclopedia, this was a practical initiative. There were a number of outline books done. Many of them remained in print until the 40s, but by then a lot of them had become, they would have the name of the individuals involved. So the idea of known authors and author's name, something which dropped away. So I'm now going to do a big jump, and I'm kind of keeping this quite brief, but I hope this makes people excited enough to look a little bit deeper. And I'm jumping forward to the wikis, which are the basis of Wikipedia. And the person who developed this was Ward Cunningham, and he developed them out of pattern languages, which Christopher Alexander, you can see there, was developing in the 60s and 70s. And if you're interested in following this up, you just have to go to the Ward Cunningham page on Wikipedia, and there's about 20-minute video of him talking and discussing things, which I think is a very good way of taking this a little bit further if you're interested. So and in the book that he in the paper that he presented in 2013, Wiki as pattern language, i.e. linking it directly to Christopher Alexander, says the wiki is today widely established as a kind of website that allows users to quickly and easily share, modify and improve information collaboratively. It's described on Wikipedia. Perhaps its best known example is a website which allows its users to add, modify and delete its content via a web browser, usually using a simplified markup language or rich text editor. So that's really Wark coming is in the whole article. He is discussing it in relationship to the prior work done by Christopher Alexander, which was taken up by other people involved in developing software. So I'm going to finish with a graphic from one of Christopher Alexander's book, which I hope will see why I see Tektology as being related to this. And this is from the Notes on the Synthesis of Form in 1964. And I was yesterday listening to Carlo's presentation. It really made me think of this, because you have over here, you have a diagram of a system with a link between every pair of independent requirements. So this is some technical discussion that Christopher Alexander goes into greater depth than I'm going to here. So really, you've got this area here, and that area there can be separated into two subsystems. So what that means is that if you treat this as one thing and that as another, you've only got these two connections linking them. So you can, it makes it a lot easier to handle. So it's a way that a system can be broken down into simpler parts, so that the simpler parts can be dealt with separately. But one of the things that Christopher Alexander uses concepts, right? He says, but since concepts are on the whole the result of arbitrary historical accidents, there's no reason to expect that they will correspond to these subsystems. And this reminded me precisely of the discussion yesterday, which was saying, well, you have various thoughts of what an atom is and everything like that, but we are actually describing experience. And as these concepts are something which emerges arbitrarily and historically, they don't necessarily correspond to the subsystem, or they don't necessarily explain them. And one thing I think is relevant to this that I would say is that you could look on that that shaded area being somebody owning intellectual property rights over certain things and not other things. And if they've got copyright over that bit, they can control that. And one of the things about Wikipedia is that it adopted a way of open commons, so that the whole information could be shared at the same time as retaining identification of the authors. And I relate that back to Kautsky, and one of the things Karl Kautsky wrote on the Morrow back in the early 1900s, where he talks about the difference between kind of material goods and intellectual goods. And he says in material goods, we will have communism for material goods, and for intellectual property, we will have anarchism. And he was a social democrat. So I think that kind of he is creating a division between the material and the ideal, so to speak. But if you look at more modern economics, like Yochai Benkler, he makes the distinction between rival and non-rival goods. So the rival goods are, if I have an apple and eat it, you can't eat it. If I have an idea and I tell it to you, we both have the idea. So the second one is non-rival. So that is the way in which a different way of thinking can supersede a previous way of thinking. And this is what I think is that if we wish to take forward a universal science of organization, there's a lot of material to work with, and I would put forward Christopher Alexander, his work, and I think there's a great deal of connections that can be made. Okay, that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fabian. Fantastically insightful talk about the affordances enabled by modern technology. Now, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. So does anyone have any questions for Maja, Noemi, or Fabian? Any hands going up? Okay, we do have Orsan or Joe. Can you see who has their hand up?
Yeah, we have Maria, who's one of our presenters. So should be able to unmute yourself, Maria, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, and sorry, I think I'm unnamed there because I forgot to put my name, but I will do after the break. Thank you for these 3 brilliant presentations, very, very interesting. I have a question to Fabian. I'm very curious also if you can say, or probably I missed, you mentioned it somehow, I came across that the international branch of Proletkult has been in some form established in Scotland and in Manchester as well, or probably this is what you discussed, the same people been somehow related to that. And secondly, with the encyclopedia and Bogdanov and these other types of encyclopedia, do you think this is, you said that this is a parallel development, but it seems to me that in Bogdanov's project of encyclopedia, he wanted not simply to, although we don't know because it never came to life, but what he writes about this encyclopedia seems to be not just simply encyclopedic entries on different concepts, but that he wanted to rework science from the working class point of view. My question is, dig into some archival, because I'm curious also about this encyclopedic project, whether you know or have any traces of something which relates to this project. Thank you.
Oh, okay, brilliant question. I would say it's worth looking a little bit deeper into H.G. Wells. He did actually, he visited Russia, stayed with Gorky in 1920. He attended the St. Peter's, the Petrograd Soviet, where he described himself as a collectivist. Now, whether this bears any relationship to Bogdanov's self-styling himself as a collectivist, I'm not sure, and I actually doubt that. He certainly saw that the university had had his day. He regarded the bourgeois university as finishing schools for the elite. So I think there's a lot that can be worked out there. I think with Paul Otlet, what he was trying to do, he was working on the Mundanium in conjunction also with Otto Neurath. Otto Neurath, I would argue, is a Austro-Marxist who again brings Marx into the work there. So I think, I mean, one of the things I got from Bogdanov, he starts talking about world communism as a phenomenon of the First World War across the different nations that were involved in fighting, the subordination of bourgeois business to fighting the war. And I think that's a very important aspect of what he's saying. And in that sense, I'm drawn more to a kind of world systems theory approach to the First World War being a crisis of the global system, and the Russia, one of the weakest links, broke away. So I wouldn't want to conflate everything together, but I would like to. I think it's worthwhile trying to draw out, you know, the whole logical positivist was about remodeling science, putting it on a more rational basis. So I think there are comparisons there, and I think maybe people are seeing similar phenomena, maybe from different perspectives, but actually phenomena that they are seeing in their own societies. I think often there is a lot of similarities there. So I think that's that's the approach I would take, and then looking at where we are now. I think certainly I enjoyed Paul's contribution earlier on, and I think on the one hand there's great opportunities for bringing knowledge together, but you know, as the latest pandemic has shown, we've got a lot of problems to deal with, and often the political ways of dealing with it have just made matters worse.
Can we move on to our second question? Craig Brandist, you had your hand up second. Joe, can you enable Craig?
I can.
Thanks. I think I'm already unmuted.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, and thank you for 3 really interesting papers. And I've got a question for Noemi. The whole question of Gramsci's time in Russia is very understudied and neglected, and the significance of that experience on Gramsci's later work is very poorly explored. And just glad to say that finally myself and Peter Thomas are going to publish a book of materials from the archive of Gramsci's time in Russia, and other material. But very interesting to learn more about the translation of Bogdanov's novel. From the text that you provided, which is very interesting, is it absolutely sure that the novel that was being translated there is Red Star, or is it simply the likely one that was being translated there? And I note as well that you say that you got that information from a letter of the 11th of October, but in your text there you provide only the reference to the postcard of the 16th of October. And I'm just wondering if there's a publication or archival reference to that that letter of the 11th of October. So sorry, it's a bit of a specific question, but maybe the only opportunity I'll have to ask it. Thank you very much.
Noemi?
Da quello che hai detto te, era una lettera dell'11 ottobre.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello? It is, he speaks about, they speak about the novel, Il romanzo, the novel of Bogdanov. No. So I suppose since Red Star had been published in many thousands of copies, if I don't mistake, 200,000 copies in the precedent year, 2 years before. I think it was a bestseller, so important. And otherwise, which other novel are you thinking of about Bogdanov's? Bogdanov's novel is written. I don't know if we can speak. I thought very longly about this. I didn't present the postcard. I'm so sorry, because in the postcard there are 2 very compromising words. In the message there are 2 postcards. In one of the in the message, Gramsci and Giulia, written in 4 hands, the message to Eugenia, they speak about chinovniki, that's bureaucrats. And in the drawings, there is a woman trying to stop a bed with many legs flying away. And he cries, stop him, he is a counter-revolutionary. So I insert all, I cross all these these things, and I suppose it was Red Star, because it was a very popular novel than in Russia. This is my. If you think about another novel, I would be happy to hear it. You.
Okay, I think Craig, Noemi has actually put her email in the chat box, so maybe if there's something specific you want to ask Noemi, maybe it might be best to exchange written emails for the communication. Noemi, you've actually got your hand up yourself. Do you have a question?
No question. I think it's very interesting to understand why Gramsci met so great an opposition here, both here in Italy, from his from the official foundations here in Italy, and in Europe. For different maybe reasons, but it is incredible because you would have to read the prison notebooks to see how long is the memory of prolet cult. It is quite the only way Gramsci thinks about revolution. It begins since he was a child, and this is always, and he speaks about not only a technical formation, but a formation in arts, literature, poetry. So a new civilization, not only a new culture, to substitute the bourgeois power. This is, I see, is so interesting and so near to what Bogdanov proposes, and I think that the inheritance of illuministic way of thinking of intellectuals, of considering intellectuals, is a sort of class prejudice. You understand? Lenin told openly that working class couldn't do, was not able to produce a new culture. Was not able, so he decided that there were two classes in human beings: the intellectuals. So without intellectuals were born to direct even the workers, but it's not different from capitalism. This is a condition not different from capitalists. You see?
Okay, I'm going to have to stop that conversation at this point. It's absolutely fascinating, and maybe it can go on afterwards. But we've got one final question for this session for Fabian. I'm taking it from the chat box. It's from Juan. Do you know of any tool to record and systematically organize the knowledge created during a revolution or upheaval apart from Wikipedia? I am not sure if new tools were developed during the Arab Spring, for example.
Right, you should be able to hear me now. I can't think of anything specifically, although people are developing practices using things like Signal and various other social media forms. So I think often it's social practices which are being developed. There is something I would like to refer to, and that is the Humanitarian Open Map team, which has got 330,000 people involved. And one of the things they do is respond to natural disasters with where they gather information and then put it on the OpenStreetMap, which is a parallel project for a kind of open source variant on Google Maps, which is again on a Creative Commons basis, so that when a specific area is transformed by flooding, mudslides, and everything like that, they try and gather information about which roads are passable, which roads are blocked. And then that can feed into various kind of services who are trying to re-establish communications, make sure people have medication, have food, etc., and everything like that. So that is the kind of example that I do know about, which again is situated very much as part of the technologically advanced countries, helping out the what could be regarded as the more backward countries, or you could regard them as the countries which have been pillaged in order to provide us with the raw materials used in our mobile phones. So whether that's actually revolutionary, I don't think it is revolutionary, but I'm sure that the will practices will emerge as they did in the Arab Spring, even if they took place via things like Google, which one of the predominant people in Egypt was actually employed by Google, as I recall. So I think that's that's an area which can be thought about, and I'm sure people will create things as they find them needed.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I've been looking at the supply of PPE, protective clothing, during the coronavirus in the UK, because the UK government was very much based on a centralised push system, and a group of technological entrepreneurs created an open source real-time platform called Frontline, which matches people in the NHS who can tweet their need with providers of protective clothing, and that emerged through this crisis. So that's kind of another example. It comes to me to draw this session really to a close. So thank you so much, Maja, Noemi and Fabian, for your presentations. I really enjoyed them so much. Orsan, do you want to say something?
Carlo Rovelli. He's here. He wants to ask something.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Oh, just a super short question. I want to take more time. Fabian, as you can imagine, I was enormously intrigued by your remarks in the last slide, the one that is still visible. So where does this quote from Christopher Alexander come from, and where can I learn more about what you said at the end there?
Right. Yeah, Christopher Alexander. Well, Wikipedia is always a good place to start. There's a page about him there. If you have access to some of the resources available in the Russia, which is often blocked in the West because of copyright reasons, there's a number of his books available there. He's still alive and active. So you might be able to contact him directly. So, there's a lot of scope there.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, Orsan, over to you to tell us a little bit about maybe what's happening this afternoon.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, all presenters. It was great. We just couldn't tame our eager because I think this is a rare occasion. There are lots of things to share, exchange. We couldn't have enough time to discuss, but maybe for afternoon, after a break, we will come back with a great discussion, conversation between Carlo and McKenzie Wark. So until then, we can rest a little bit. But afternoon, if we try to stick with the times, we might have more time for discussion, exchange, but of course it is difficult to compress it only to the presentations. So now we can just have time for lunch and relax a little bit and come back refreshed 1 hour later with a great conversation between McKenzie and Carlo.
Okay, great stuff. Right, I will start this this process, although it's my job just to make this a productive conversation between you, McKenzie, and you, Carlo. You both written about Bogdanov, his Carlo's book Helgoland, which has a section on Bogdanov, and McKenzie, Molecular Red was your excursion into explaining Bogdanov and why he was important to your work. We do have a title, although I imagine it's going to be a very free-ranging conversation, and the title is Bogdanov, Lenin, and Scientific Philosophy. So I'm going to set you off on that course, and then please go wherever you will. Lenin, of course, believed that science could yield objective truth, that it could provide truth for all time. So, for example, dialectical materialism was a truth that science gave us and which was relevant to the way that society developed and the way that the natural world developed. But Bogdanov questioned that, and that was one of the reasons why Lenin fell out with him. For Bogdanov, truth depended upon the social organization of production, and therefore was relative to a particular era in time. So an idea or a concept like that of matter, which for Lenin was fundamental, for Bogdanov was not fixed. It was historical, and its meaning changed in the science that was appropriate for its particular era. So do you mind if we just start with that, which is close to the title of what you've been asked to discuss, and to put your work in the context of that Bogdanov's belief that there is no absolute fixed forever scientific truth.
Who's first? You go first, McKenzie.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Can people see me? I'm weirdly in the bottom of the screen. I'm not really a Microsoft person. Yeah, I was interested in Bogdanov for a number of reasons, and he ended up a central figure in this book, Molecular Red, which was a few years ago now. And thinking through the way we can think science as a kind of labor, and one that's open-ended, which on the one hand, as Bogdanov might say, is kind of constrained by the form of organization, within which it's structured at any particular historical time, but which is also open towards the generation of sensations gathered from the world, their organizing, the testing and verification, and the extracting of forms of knowledge appropriate to the particular configuration that you find. So it struck me that if one wanted a Marxist philosophy of science, that Bogdanov was a good place to start, given that it's not defining in advance through a kind of contemplative philosophical practice what the materialism in historical materialism would actually be. And as we now know, the sort of 19th century popular version of what materialism is, that was sometimes taken to be foundational for Marxism, doesn't really stand up to what the open-ended practices of scientific discovery have since found material, matter, quote unquote, to be. All of which I think is really nicely laid out in Carlo's Helgoland, and much more professionally done, given that I'm coming at this more from history of thought and philosophy side. I'm not a scientist and wouldn't claim to know what we know about the physical world, but I think that's appropriate to not think philosophy can be all-encompassing and have a general theory in advance of everything, but to leave space for collaborative, comradely labor with other fields, and where indeed philosophy's role might be quite minor in relation to the sciences, of being able to articulate and connect. And I think Bogdanov is a great connector, looking for ways in which different fields of knowledge might have something for each other. And I think his Tektology is mostly aimed at that. And I read it as a kind of poetics of knowledge. How can we get a hypothesis about the organization of the world from one science, take it to another, and test it, right? So we're not generating a metaphysics over and above everything. It's like, oh, we find things look like this here, and we can verify that knowledge. what poetically does that have to say to another field? It's not yet knowledge until it's tested and verified somewhere else. So yeah, it struck me that Bogdanov was useful for getting us out of attempts to make philosophy a kind of sovereign discourse over the sciences, which always strikes me as a kind of a mistake to try to do that. And as Bogdanov would say, it's usually then going to be imposing metaphorically diagrams from obsolete forms of social organization and preventing us from discovering the new, discovering the world and rediscovering the world.
Great. Carlo, would you like to take that up?
Yeah, let me say something also as an introduction for me. First, I want to start by saying that when so this idea of this dialogue came out with McKenzie, for me it was a great surprise, because I was actually reading Molecular Red. I was in the middle of reading Molecular Red, and it's Molecular Red it's a book that for me was a bit shocking, because I encountered it in a moment in which I was sort of falling in love with Bogdanov, which I didn't know 5 or 6 years ago, and I encountered by chance, because in Italy there is a novel, a sort of fictional version of his life that was published by some very nice writers from Bologna, the place where one of the places where I grew up. And then I got curious, and then I sort of really fell in love with Bogdanov things. But McKenzie book has sort of 4 heroes. One with Bogdanov, one is Barad, who also I had recently discovered and got completely fascinated, because her reading of Bohr and the use she does of quantum mechanics and Bohr thinking, I found it fantastic. And the third one, Kim Stanley Robinson, has always been one of my heroes. I've been totally in love with Robinson since ever. Not so much. Robinson is a great writer, but I've been in love with him not just for his imagination, but mostly for his politics. Platonov, which is the 4th hero of this book, I didn't know him. But out of 4, 3 were incredibly close and dear to my heart. So a book about that, which is a strange combination, obviously an extremely strange combination of people that McKenzie wrote. It really hit me, and it was great. I must say, I don't read you easily. Sometimes your prose is hard for me because of the sort of the cultural world where I come from. But certainly, so much of what you do resonate with my way of thinking. So I would start by sort of reading the last line of your book, which is, "We all know these civilizations can't last, so let's make another," which is it's a wonderful closure, I think, of a book that says a lot. So let me come to your question, Mike. Bogdanov for me is a recent discovery, but I'm a physicist, so mostly I've worked on technical matters in physics, but foundational physics and sort of highly conceptual problems that come out from doing quantum gravity. And because of that, and because of also who I am and my culture, I've also been strongly interested all my life in philosophy and philosophy of science in particular. And so I've been, I am close. In fact, I also am, I work with philosophers of science in the analytic tradition. So a very different world from, critical theory, very different language. 2 worlds that insults each other constantly, and I try to navigate between the two. In my view of philosophy of science has moved a lot from the analytic tradition has moved a lot from the Vienna circles and from the sort of neo-positivism of half a century ago. In my opinion, the way I've seen science, the way I look science, it's a way of thinking, a form of thought that is based on the assumption that there's a lot we don't know, and in what we know, there are probably all sorts of things which are wrong. So it's constantly open to self-criticisms at all levels. And I think recent philosophy of science in the analytic tradition recognizes that, which means that there is a sort of anti-foundationalism, which is, I wouldn't say diffused, but certainly existing in the what I would consider the better self-consciousness of contemporary science. This is Machian, this is Bogdanovian in some sense, because but this goes together with, I think, the fact that more recent philosophy of science, like Popper and Kuhn, tend to disregard that this is not in contradiction with a cumulative aspect in our knowledge. We do know things that we didn't know before, and this has piled up. It doesn't mean that it's going to continue. There's no guarantee here whatsoever. But there's no doubt, seems to me, that there's some cumulative aspect, which do not regard our certainties, and that's key point, but regards what reliably can we say about the world, keeping in mind that we know that there are wrong things. So in trying to work out for myself, mostly, a way of bringing everything together, and bringing together the fact, the deep awareness of how much knowledge is a cultural product of society together, and its various kind of struggles and interactions, together with what we know about the actual world from science. Bogdanov came to me as a surprising tool, as offer incredible tools, because this central idea of organization, it works both ways. So it works as a way for making sense of nature, and it works as a way for making sense of what it means for us to make sense of nature. And that is what I was fascinated, what fascinated me in Bogdanov, is bringing together these two sides, which of course Bogdanov takes from Marx, Engels, takes from Mach, takes from a number of ways, but he offers tools, and I think for thinking about the world that we describe is the organization of our experience about the world, and it's a social organization, as Bogdanov very strongly point our science, but nature itself, and that's what somehow Bogdanov was so keenly aware of, and it's wonderful that he was so aware of in sort of in a moment in which science was in deep trouble, but just before the biggest jumps. I mean, Bogdanov had a text on Einstein relativity, but I don't think he was much aware of quantum mechanics and the deep revolutions in physics that were going on, which took some time. But he certainly was aware that physics was not a sort of bringing together getting fundamentally final truth about nature, but finding better and better ways to making sense of nature there. Now this, and then I close, I'm talking too long. This is, for me, made a sort of a spark when my entire work on trying to make sense of quantum mechanics converged in the 90s to the idea that the way we understand the world in terms of the relations between things and not in terms of things, because that closes the circle. So we understand the world in terms of how things correlate to one another, affect one another, interact with one another. Not in terms, this is what the best physics we have today tell us. And then we understand how we are naturally part of that world. Our knowledge is just one of the many aspects of the interactive aspect of nature. And that's, in all that, Bogdanov for me was a source of ideals, tools, which I feel is far from exhausted. So I would close by saying, it's not so much the systematic, it's not so much because Tektology offer, okay, now we have found a way of organizing everything forever. No. It's just one step ahead in a better. What I like about Bogdanov is his awareness that knowledge and culture and what we're doing, organization, are processes which are immersed. We're not looking for a final point. So we're not looking for the final everything. This civilization can't last. Let's make another. Then we'll think the next one.
There's a more elegant way of organizing your sensations, as Mach would say. That's what knowledge is.
That's what knowledge is. And Bogdanov says that psychology is an individual organization of experience, while science is a social organization of experience.
Absolutely.
Which doesn't make it less credible. It makes it more credible. Yeah. That's the point.
Carlo, thanks for that wonderful explanation of what you got out of Bogdanov. McKenzie, when you talk about Bogdanov in the book, it's one of the forgotten histories that you want to bring forward, that can open the way for a new critical theory, as you put it, suitable for the Anthropocene. Could you expand on that in the same way that Carlo has? In other words, what's the main thing you've got out of Bogdanov's work?
You could work backwards from the we all know the civilization is over, let's make another one, to the, oh, well, what would be the practice of making another one? Like that's an enormous task. So how would you organize science and labor to make a kind of world that could endure? Because this one clearly can't. Yeah, we're kind of at that point. I actually got interested in Bogdanov because he, like, briefly and tantalizingly talks about biosphere. It shows up, and he's sort of got a little bit of the physics right in terms of the knowledge of the time. And it's a proposition that's not verifiable at the time with the tools of the time, so he doesn't sort of pursue it, but he's kind of aware of, like, oh, if you put extra carbon in the atmosphere, something will happen. And there's clearly a sense of that in Red Star, that the Martians destroyed their forests and changed their climate and need a new energy source. And I'm like, oh, he's not alone in thinking these things, but rare in the Marxist tradition in paying attention to those things. That was, for me, that was initially sort of the hook. And then, yeah, I am interested in when certain critical traditions seem to have exhausted themselves or come to impasses. What if you take 2 steps back to take 3 steps forward? An expression of Lenin's, actually. But it's like, oh, in this case, back to Bogdanov and the sort of Marxist strain in Marxist thought, because it is trying to put together a sort of a critical view of the current form of organization that we have, with thinking organization as kind of a collective practice and how you would sort of re-engage that to build, kind of another world for another life. So yeah, that was how I got interested in Bogdanov. Yeah, it's what is it? It's the Seaview Publishers edition of the Tektology, I think. Rare sensitive these days, and I actually lucked into my own personal copy of that.
Yes.
First Bogdanov that I read, which I turned into a PDF, and you can find that online pretty easily now for people who want to study it, because the knowledge should be free, even though we're aware of the constraints of the commodity economy makes that difficult. Yeah, so and it's a monist theory that struck me as useful, and I read Carlo is saying that we're part of nature is referring back to that tradition of how one thinks of the human as kind of component of a larger world that organizes itself, and then there are components that we organize within it. So it all struck me as sort of useful, that there was a way out of certain impasses where we could go back to Bogdanov and resurrect the Machists as a more general approach to thinking, where what you're highlighting is different forms of praxis and what kind of relation could they have with each other that's outside of authority. And that, to me, seems to be the problem with Leninism. Yeah, so Lenin was pro-science, but there's still this notion of like a dialectical materialism. There's this sovereign discourse over all the others, which we know Soviet scientists are obliged to speak in ways that are actually interesting, but which also could go horribly wrong, as the example of the Lysenko affair shows. And I don't think Soviet Union is alone in imposing ideological, sort of control on scientific knowledge. There's a sort of fetishizing of that example in the Cold War. We're not entirely free of that either. So how can one think in a way that's both critical and constructive about the role of science in organization of the world such that the world endures?
Mm.
Which is a Kim Stanley Robinson riff as well, right? We share an interest in Stan.
Yeah. Look, I can't resist now. I'm going to take you up on Kim Stanley Robinson, both of you, because I started reading it. I'm nearly 2/3 of the way through, and it's absolutely fascinating. Sometimes in the morning I think I've been on Mars all night because I've been dreaming about these trips around Mars. And then you're suddenly interrupted in the book by discussions on scientific methodology or the right political system to adopt on Mars. I've not got. Are you mentioned, Carlo, in the book? I read some.
Yes, I am mentioned in the book. Yes, in passing.
I get to that bit, but it must be on page 2000 or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, full disclosure. Well, that's the reason I originally got to that, because I'm not a great reader of science fiction. I mean, I like some Philip Dicks, but I'm not particularly fan. But one day I received a message from somebody, you know that your name is in a science fiction book. So I just got the book and looked through and found my name. It's the book is settled in the next century, and the physics of that century has some leftover of things that I did censored before. So that's how I got it. But then I started reading the book. Okay, I was like, maybe I should read more, and it captured me immensely.
For those who don't know, there's a character in the book called Arkady Bogdanov, who turns out to have been related to Alexander Bogdanov, and I can't. It's hard to see the direct relationship between the ideas of, in my view, Alexander and Arkady. But anyway, it just makes it interesting. But again, I'd like to ask you the same question of what you find is so interesting in that trilogy of books that's important to you. It's the debate between different ways, different discourses in terms of how to construct a new world, I guess, as you were saying, McKenzie. It's interesting.
I mean, one of there are so many interesting things about those books. One is that, and I mean this in the best possible way, there's a way in which the Mars trilogy is obsolete. Stan was using the available knowledge about Mars of the time, not all of which is right. And that's a good thing about so-called hard science fiction, is it's sort of based on what you know, but what you know will change. He has a book called 2012 that updates some of that with sort of things that we know, for example, about Mars that wasn't available to him in the 90s. Like he was like poring over old NASA maps. Like it's so much of it's landscape writing. And was telling me a lot of it's based on, he's cumulatively spent years of his life in the Sierras in California. So a lot of it's based on a practice of being in a landscape that's not entirely unlike Mars in some of its harshness. Means by which you would attempt to adapt to being in it. One of the great things about it is it's sort of, and it is a bit in its the naming a character after Bogdanov is a nod to Red Star, also a novel set on Mars, and also a novel that's utopian in a sense. And I think Stan was, and it's a sort of radical proposition in a way. It's like, oh, what if you wrote a meta-utopia where all of the utopian ways of thinking that he could gather in the late 20th century have a debate with each other about and how to compromise. Like there's like a constitutional convention where all of the different kinds of utopianists get together and sort of hash it out, like what's the role of the market and do we have representative democracy? Like, they sort of figure that out. And elsewhere he's written the Constitution for Mars is in a collection I think it's called The Martians, something like that. So yeah, that struck me as fascinating because I'm interested in utopias. I'm interested interested in scientific practices and their relation to social change. So yeah, I found those books kind of fascinating. I recommend 2012, which is a sort of more recent sort of book that he wrote in the same cosmology. And to declare an interest, I would be a Bogdanovite, like it's a faction.
You would be.
In that struggle around how you would build the future was the thing that appealed to me. And I also want to mention, I haven't read the Prolet Cult book by Wu Ming, but I've personally met one of Wu Ming, and if I may, they're kind of comrades in a certain way of doing intellectual politics from the late 20th century. So I shout out to them, and I hope somebody translates their novel into a language I can read, because I'm sorry to say Italian's not one of them.
Carlo, do you want to comment on the trilogy?
Yes, you asked why why I liked it in a sense. It's profoundly intelligent and it's profoundly rich in his complexity. Unlikely many other science fiction utopians or dystopians, which are often one-dimensional. Okay, this could happen, and then let's zoom focus on that. Or it's really a large spectrum of ideas which are happening and disputed. But the obvious resonance point is that the world in which we live is not the only possible world, and that's the core of the utopian ideas, and which is the idea that it's has moved history repeatedly in the past, and that's coming up so strongly in the book, and it is beautifully precisely because it comes up so strongly in this intelligent way, which is not just one. I mean, let's do that perfect society, and then of course somebody else will say yes, but it wouldn't work, or I wouldn't like it, or whatever. There's a full discussion of that. Robinson is extraordinarily knowledgeable in science, in politics, also in different sciences, all sorts of things. He has a lot of knowledge about history, different cultures, so it all come together. It is a little bit up. It is somehow outdated read tonight. I mean, it's a political debates of the years of my youth, not of today. But that doesn't take it away the fact in my opinion, and somehow I recognized in the debates between Arkady Bogdanov and Anne and the various characters that go to Marx, which are very different in their characters and in their ideology. There's something Dostoevskian in that. Each, Dostoevsky has this incredible things because a strong character, think about Karamazov, each one is a carrier of an ideology, a way of looking at the world. So and you see how different perspective of the world, they're all incredibly true in humans and embodied in humanity. And you have the brother Karamazov discussing with one another, and it's really the different part of humankind discussing with another. There's something similar in Robinson, and that's the richness, the beauty of it. And I recognize the same discussions of when I was a kid, and there was my hippie friends and my Leninist friends and my Trotskyist friends and my Christian friends debating on what kind of world we wanted and how to get there. That is what fascinated me. Plus, he's a great writer. He's a great story.
McKenzie's declared for Arkady Bogdanov. Do you have any preference? Are you a Mars first or?
And the red.
You're the red. There's something else going in the book as well, which is relevant to Bogdanov, if I may, which is the way that technology tends to explode and take everything forward before they have the right types of organization to manage the technology. And that would be a lesson from Bogdanov as well, wouldn't it? That you have to get your forms of organization in place before you can maximize the benefits from technology. McKenzie, I'm fascinated by this. You say the nearest we have had to a technological research program is that of Donna Haraway. Could you just explain that a little bit more? Because I'm fascinated by that idea.
Yeah, there's a way I think you can relate some aspects of Haraway's earlier work, and I was talking about her earlier work in Molecular Red. I think it tends towards a general metaphysics in her later work that I'm less interested in. But the early stuff is about science as practices, and the way that there's a chapter in her thesis, which became her first book, on Joseph Needham, a figure I find incredibly interesting, and is kind of a Marxist in a lot of ways. And you know, if I could get some leave and some time to trace out how much the early scientific Marxists in Britain in the 1930s were more Bogdanovite than Leninist that they knew. Some of the early work circulating in English translation was actually by Bogdanov. British communists were actually reading Bogdanov, right? You know, because anyway, that's a whole other story. But to what extent could we think, rather than the human in relation to the world, to think human techniques and whatever appears as nature as the object of a kind of systematic design of human plus techniques together? So to kind of break down that boundary of seeing the human as always separate and somehow universal in relation to the technical object. So to me, it's a sort of extension of Bogdanovite thinking, to think techniques as shaped by the larger social organization of their time, as well as shaping it, and then to sort of trace out how in any particular era the human technic relation is producing ways of perceiving the world that are specific to that historical moment. So, I mean, for example, to what extent is classical mechanics in part a product of the techniques that was being developed at the time? We had steam engines before we had thermodynamics. There's a way you extract a kind of way of systematizing and organizing knowledge out of a practice. People designing steam engines didn't know they were doing experimental science, but they were, and trying to figure it out for a practical reason in the world, mostly to get water out of the bottom of coal mines, because the coal mines were so deep, because the coal was getting so exhausted, you needed an efficient way to do that. So to kind of think techniques as not just applied science, but coming from the other direction as well, as that sort of mediator. That's when we talk about how we organize the world, the mediator is kind of always a technics. And it's a techniques that kind of shapes what we can think the human is. So I sort of put Haraway in relation to Bogdanov and Platonov. And the other thing that was interesting to me is, how do you think through the history of very, very large organizational problems? And we had two very, very large organizational problems in the 20th century. One was organizing the Soviet Union, and the other was organizing the United States and its kind of global empire. So how do you think at scale? And if we need to think planetary scale, why don't we start by thinking the largest subunits of that historically that the 20th century dealt with? And to think through their different kinds of failure. I mean, clearly Soviet Union as a form of organization kind of failed. And I want to argue so did the United States, and we're living inside its failure at the moment. The thing I didn't really touch on would be the third one you'd want to know about, which is the Organization of the People's Republic of China. And you kind of like, I'd sort of look at that and I go, what even is that? I can't even classify it in terms of the categories I inherited. Some people would say it's become neoliberal capitalism, and it's like, I don't know if that's really accurate. It seems that, you know, the largest chunk of sort of geopolitics in the world is being run by a Leninist party, and no one wants to admit it, you know, like. But so that would be the great anomaly historically that would need us to sort of shed a bunch of metaphysical assumptions about what history is and what its categories are, to sort of study that all over again. I'm not an advocate of the PRC, just to be very clear. I just think it's an object of study, and as a form of organization, that would be the third one that I'd want to do.
Yeah, one of the discussions we had this morning, I think, touches on sort of Haraway's ideas, which is, you know, for Bogdanov, it was clear what the agency of change was in society to bring forward the next better society, which was the proletariat. which became capable of becoming world builders. I don't know whether Carlo, I think McKenzie, the concept of the cyborg is relevant here. It's all the alienated people in a sense. But Carlo, do you have a notion of this? You know, going back to our youth, it was the it wasn't the proletariat so much, but in Marcuse's sense, it was disenfranchised people and students and the potential alliance with workers. It was more, nowadays people talk about it, all those with access to technology can perhaps somehow work together to transform things. I'm just asking you, what do you see as an agency nowadays that could bring about change to a better world?
Mike, I'm glad you asked this question and you raised this question. I have a clear answer here, which is I don't know. And not only I don't know, but it's a question that is hunting me, has been hunting me for the last years and for several years, in fact, for a couple of decades, if not more. It's because let me put it this way. McKenzie says talked about the organization of the Soviet Empire. It was an empire, also that one, and the American Empire. Now the organization of China is 1 billion people. They have experience. They have 20th century of experience of organizing 1 billion people. So that's why they're pretty good. But of course, the current problem of humankind is not this one, right? It's organizing humankind as a whole in precisely for the problems which from which molecular red starts. I mean, the climate, the general environmental crisis that we're going to face, plus others, plus many others. This in spite of attempts, ideas, of course, I would say all socialists, men and women for goodwill trying. It's not happening. We're going the other direction. We're going toward fragmentation, not global organization. And I came up from a sort of revolutionary, hopeful youth, and went through the disappointment of the of that. I used to call it failed revolution. And I don't see. I mean, what Marx and Engels offered very clearly, it's a powerful hypothesis of who are the forces of change that can change society. What are the forces of change that will change society? I mean, McKenzie, I remember the previous work of yours, right? The people, I forgot your terminology, the victorialist and the hacker. I mean, I forgot what was it. But these are not the people who are going to change society. That's not enough for changing society. Where is the force of changing coming from? It's obvious that humankind needs a steering force. And the only way, I look around, I mean, there's an immense amount of social disparity in the world. There is a profoundly polarization between the rich and poor all over the world, which is not country, but is within each countries going on. There is a tension growing at all levels, but I don't see the organization happening. I really don't see it, and I don't see the 21st century analog of the proletarian at all.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree.
I keep reading, and if let me be, I opened Molecular Red like I opened many books, saying, "Can I find ideas?" I don't.
I was hoping McKenzie would give us the answer as well, but he's nothing in his head.
Well, she does to some extent, but it's enough. I mean, what do you think, McKenzie?
I mean, Carlo, I think we're roughly contemporaries. We had kind of similar youthful ambitions. I think we both understand defeat and what it means to belong to a current history that was defeated. And I think that's a very important thing to think. And it's a thing that Bogdanov thought about a lot because they lost the 1905 revolution. And there's a whole kind of like there's a turn to the utopian after that to sort of rethink, well, what did we want in the first place anyway? And you can put Red Star in that context. So it's sort of that you kind of understand something about the social forces that work in history doesn't mean you can solve it. Yeah. That you have an understanding of why your house is on fire does not in itself give you the power to put it out. But it struck me that there's something useful in, and it's a sort of Bogdanov gesture to try to have done with metaphysical assumptions about who the forces of social change are, to try to look at the present moment and to think through, there's still plenty of labor in the world. It's what most people do. It's a part of what I do. But to labor is to work within a production system designed by somebody else where you're exploited for somebody else's benefit. Well, we know that's a ruling class, but the bit that's missing is who designed the labor practice. What are the forces whose job is not doing the same thing over and over again, but whose job is creating new things? Who is that class? To me, that's a way of thinking where people who are in engineers or artists or scientists, what is our collective class interest? It doesn't necessarily mean we can change the world by identifying our class interest, but I think it would help if we could do that rather than getting caught in those things of being the humanities versus the sciences and all that. It's so incredibly unhelpful. We all have little bits of knowledge that's contingent and specific, and we sort of thought through how to thread all of those things together, respect each other's labor processes, respect each other's authority, but also that it's limited. So yeah, what would comradely labor be among those of us who produce? What will eventually be the techniques everybody works in, but also what will eventually be the sort of affective, emotional and systems that all of us work in. Because that's one of Bogdanov's great insights is, materialist philosophy is sort of attached to the how you materially organize labor, but idealist philosophy is really just coming out of how you organize people's motivation and thoughts so that they're part of that labor as well. So yeah, what if we put different kinds of knowledge production together as a class interest? I think that would at least be a little step along the way. And it's also what Kim Stanley Robinson is talking about, because interestingly, that's a revolution led by scientists, some of whom also turn out to be very sophisticated cultural workers at the same time.
I've got one more suggested topic before I hand over to the audience to ask you questions. I don't know whether either of you've read Yanis Varoufakis, Another Now. He's the Greek economist who postulates post-capitalist society. You'd be interested, Carlo, and well, you'd both be interested, I hope, because it's a science fiction novel whereby there are two universes, one in which the status quo is re-established after the 2008 financial crisis, and another parallel universe in the multiverse where there was a revolution after the 2008 financial crisis. And in and Varoufakis describes what life is like in the revolutionary period. I won't ask you to read the book, but think about Red Mars. We live in a particular universe now. Let's say that Red Mars is Red Star predicts another universe. Now, in Varoufakis' book, the characters get the chance, if they wish, because they develop the capacity to move in the multiverse. They get the capacity to move from where they are now to the Bolshevik utopia of Red Mars. This really stood me up. Would I take this chance? I'm bored with all these contradictions. But I'd like to ask you that question. Would you take the leap and move to Red Mars, the Bolshevik utopia, or is there too much you feel you would lose in the current society?
It reminds me of a very old Bertolucci film, which was before the revolution. I don't know what's the title in Italian, but where it's and that's sort of the emotional conundrum for its protagonist. Would I lose too many of the pleasures of life were I to side with the revolution? And I honestly, at this stage of my life, can't decide that. I would like to think I would choose Red Mars, but I like my current life as well. So I've been corrupted by bourgeois affect in that sense. But it's that I haven't read that novel, but it's intervening in a moment in exactly the way Bogdanov did. Like after the defeat of 05 comes Red Star, to kind of think through, how do you sort of think through what affectively might be the thing that we would desire, and why we sacrifice for it in the moment when it seemed unachievable, right? Because they, you know, like we really all thought 05 was a big defeat.
Carlo, have you got more used to fighting than winning? And
I think that the interesting question is it's not whether I would choose the other, which one I would choose. I would certainly have strong reasons for both choices. But what about, we are what, 8.7 billion of us on planet. What about the other sort of 8.9999? How many would choose something different? That's an interesting point. And I think that the majority of the people on the planet are are torn between the promises of modernity getting to them and the disappointment of what they, I mean, the deep disparity in which they are immersed, which they don't see being, and that seems to me the answer. I mean, the majority of people live out of an illusion which might soon break.
Yeah, it's what the other people would, the majority. Okay, look, I'm not going to hold you because I want to give space to the audience to ask questions. I'm being selfish. Who is moderating the audience's questions? Orsan?
Hi, Mike. This is a kind of psychedelic experience, so I couldn't dare to intervene. But there came up a strong urge. I wanted to ask your opinion, or how do you think about, because this discussion about kind of scientific socialism, Marx, thinking about social complexity in a new way, novel way, and he's inventing a method of historical materialism, which is actually in terms of relations and totality, contradictory totality, it is not that much difference than relational thinking, Carlo, you are seeing in Bogdanov. But what happens is really interesting. There's an interesting story there. In the 1870s, 60s, there's an anti-Hegelian climate in Germany, and this discussion between Haeckel and Du Bois Raymond. There's a flame of scientific revolutions. So Hegelian approach to reality is losing its ground, and neo-Kantians coming in, providing a scientific, non-metaphysical approach. But they suggest a limit to knowledge, scientific knowledge, and Haeckel confront this. At that time, Engels thinks that is also undermining Marx, their Hegelianism. So he provides this idea that you can apply historical materialism to the nature also. So he starts writing dialectic nature of dialectics of nature, but he cannot complete it because I think because Hegel is not appropriate for that. Anyway, I don't want to go in details, but there is this continuation of that thing is Bernstein bringing Engels' unfinished book to Einstein and asking his opinion, if it's worthy of scientific, it has a scientific worth. He says this is historical, I mean, it has a historical importance, but not a scientific one. I see Bogdanov is coming in with Mach and Avenarius, synthesizing Marx materialism, monistic materialism, with the neutral monism of Mach and Avenarius. So he's providing a new way of combining. I mean, it sounds like he's inventing something. In a way, you can apply historical materialism also to nature, and then he progressively moves to the universal organizational science. How would you think that kind of reading?
I mean, the first thing is to point out the thing Engels was right about, which was that the sciences are going to be extremely important. And the way that Marx identifies political economy as a thing that requires critical attention from, let's say 1850s on, Engels is like, wait a minute, sciences are also a powerful form of institutionalized knowledge that's organizing the world, because that's clear in the late 19th century. But then the way he goes about it doesn't work. Like it's sort of trying to find all of nature as dialectical is not terribly helpful. It's kind of constructing a sort of metaphysics that you impose on the science and interpret it through, rather than allowing the sciences to give you results that change your worldview. And that's why Bogdanov is useful, because in Bogdanov it really is historical materialism. Like what you think the material world is historical. It's going to keep changing. So you can't sort of calcify it into some sort of philosophical system and think that that will be good for all time. There are gestures towards the open-endedness of dialectical materialism, but they're not real. It turned out not to be helpful. And for Bogdanov, what is Marxism? It's the organized and organizing thought of the working class. That's it. That's the definition, right? It's not this or that dogma or doctrine at all. It's a thing continual in process. And then the other thing that's sophisticated about Bogdanov is he says it's also a way of organizing knowledge. What if we thought Marxism as comradely knowledge production? And the thing about that is it points to a very different kind of organization of the world than the Leninist party. And even though he was one of its co-creators, it's pointing towards what would be a different form of organization. And we still don't have answers to that question, yeah? But I think that was a radical proposition. And it's why like Lenin is an historical figure, but there's something unresolved about the questions Bogdanov was trying to pose for us in a way that I feel is still very contemporary.
Yeah, just a comment. I'm completely sympathetic, McKenzie, to this reading, and which resonates with. I'm not a historian. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a historian. So I'm not going to comment on what exactly happened at the turn of the century between Engels and Mach and Bogdanov and the others. Also, as I always say, I tend to read a lot of philosophy and a lot of history, but not looking for the differences, but looking what I can steal and learn from each. So I tend to agree with more people than disagree with more people, because I ignore the things which I disagree with. I just not interested, but I find some good ideas and, oh, good, this I can do. But let me add, since my role is a scientist after all, let me add a key point here. In the moment in which you think about knowledge as organization of the experience, and you can think of society as the organization of labor, and you can think in this organizational terms, which is the mark of Bogdanov. You might be afraid that you are losing something which science is telling us about the world, how the world is, and I think, and that's the death of this thinking, that you're not, because the content of science itself seems to work remarkably coherently with this picture, precisely because of this same idea has worked in science to better understand the world, not to worse understand the world. And my work of quantum mechanics, in a sense, is essentially focused on that. Barrett insists a lot. You talk about Barrett in your book a lot, that the phenomena are phenomena with respect to the apparatus that measure them. But this is deeper. It goes deeper than that, because quantum mechanics doesn't tell us that things that the best way of thinking of nature is how the phenomena interact with us, nor how the phenomena interact with apparatus, nor how the phenomena interact with machines, just how nature interacts with nature. So our best way of understanding the world is in terms of this organization of nature. the beautiful, fantastic step in our knowledge that was Newtonian physics in terms of, I mean, the original Newtonian, not even the 19th and the 18th century mechanicism. I mean, we do understand the world in terms of little stones bouncing around. Was wonderful, but it's limited. It's just one step in our organization of the world. It doesn't work well that way. So it is true that an electron, when it interacts with something that determines position, and when it interacts with something that determines its velocity, behaves in ways which are contradictory. So we cannot reduce, it's a fact of nature. We cannot reduce electrons as things by itself, which then there is a story about how we know it. The electron is the way it interacts with something else. So this relational view of thinking about nature, it seems to me is definitely more powerful within our current science today. And at the same time, it sort of breaks and collapses the distinction between the observer and the observed, between the theory and what the theory describes, between humankind and nature, between the social organization of knowledge and what nature does by itself. It's just the same thing. We have a coherent way of viewing that, which is a useful way of organizing our knowledge and thinking of how nature is organized. It's this coherence which I found fascinating that Bogdanov allows to offer. It's a good step. I don't want to think as a definitive step in any sense, but it's a good step in better moving and organizing our being in knowledge and in nature.
I've changed my thinking around some of these things since Molecular Red, which is sort of 4 years ago now. And Carlo, partly because of you. So thank you. There's an elegance, and I also appreciate the elegance of your prose, but then the elegance of the thinking, where the relational view comes out of that. So let me just say thank you for that.
Has anybody else recovered from their psychedelic experience to ask another question?
There is a hand.
There was a hand up, but it's Kemati. Do you want to?
I think Joe need to.
Yeah, they should be able to use.
Yep, I can speak now. Can I ask my question?
Yes, please.
Yep, thank you for great, lectures today. McKenzie and Carlo. Carlo is my guru indeed. I don't study physics, but I try to follow, his books, especially The Arrow of Time. The book about time was brilliant and changed my ideas and understanding about time in complex systems indeed. I did my PhD in Center for Systems Studies, so I'm a, system thinker by education. My question is that, how close is Bogdanov's ideas to process philosophy of, Alfred North Whitehead, because Alfred North Whitehead is exactly speaking of becoming. Nothing is finished, everything is becoming, and this, the division between nature and social breaks down there as well, because everything is in the process and we are flowing in the river of the, I can say, life or nature, either social or not. And I was thinking that how these two ideas are close together. Thank you.
I can only give a partial answer. First of all,